So this would be our last lecture video on the topic of welfare economics and efficiency. Now we are going to see the concept of tax incidences. So earlier I mentioned that whenever there is a tax regulation, both the parties suffer. That is, both the suppliers and the buyers suffer from taxation. So they have to share the tax burden. Now, this distribution of tax burden, like who's suffering more, is actually called tax incidence. So it uh, shows you the distribution of the tax burden. And how to see this, actually, we need the concept of elasticity here to understand. So let me show you with a graph. So this is price quantity. So this is this is an elastic supply curve. So relatively it is elastic. However, now we are going to use a inelastic demand curve. Let's say this is a inelastic demand curve. Yes. So now this is the equilibrium point. P star, Q star. Now the government decides to impose a tax. So now because of that, both the suppliers and buyers would be affected, and they would share the tax burden. Now, how do they share it? So first, so I will show you how to simply draw the graph whenever there's a some sort of tax imposed. So let's say this is the amount. Now the buyers has to pay. The buyers have to pay. This is P1. So the corresponding quantity demanded here, or they are buying, let's say Q1. The next part is to find out the amount received by the sellers. So how do you do that? This is the where it intersects. So you draw the corresponding price level, that is P2. So this is the amount received by the amount as in received by the sellers, which means that this would be the price per unit that the sellers would be receiving. So price per unit received by sellers, and this is the price per unit paid by the buyers. Paid by the buyers. All right. So as you can see, now of course we have new consumer surplus and new producer surplus, but I want you to uh, focus on the tax burden distribution part. That is, this part is actually the tax burden on the buyers, and this bit is actually the tax burden on the sellers. So whenever the demand is inelastic and let's say supply is relatively elastic, the tax burden uh, would be more. So the weight of the tax burden would be more on the buyers end than the burden on the suppliers end. And it is actually the opposite when you are seeing a case of uh, elastic demand, inelastic supply. So so in case of inelastic supply, let's say inelastic supply, let me draw that as well so that you can understand. So let's say demand is, so demand is elastic. However, the supply is, so the supply is inelastic, right? Supply demand. So this was the market price. Now there is some sort of tax imposed. Now this is P star, this is Q star. Then after the tax is imposed, the price per unit paid by the buyers, let's say it's here P1 or P prime. Now the corresponding quantity would be Q prime. Now, which one would be the price per unit received by the sellers? This would be here. So as I said, if we are dealing with a case of inelastic supply and elastic demand, then the burden is more, the tax burden is more on the suppliers, whereas this is the tax burden on the buyers. So it depends on the elasticity. However, we are not going to get into details of this elasticity and tax incidences, but there is no harm in knowing how the distribution of tax burden is actually observed. So that's how it is. It depends on the elasticity. In our maths or in Eco 1.1, we are going to assume that the elasticity is actually equal in both the for both the demand function and the supply function. The elasticity is same. So the tax burden hence would also be equal.